Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Musharraf Zaidi here at your service once again. The second session at our 2025 summit is, we've titled it A Playbook for Citizens. And really, this is the conversation in which we wanted to explore what this year will be like for the ordinary citizen across the developing world, but especially here in Pakistan, which again, our home country, and obviously a place that's super important, not just for us as a firm, as the Bad Lab, but I think a country that's really important for all the other countries in the region and many countries beyond the region. How citizens feel, what their endowment is, what kind of human capital is being invested in them, what kind of human capital they represent. These are really key questions, and ideally, we want 2025 to be a really positive year, and so what would it take for that to come to fruition? Like the previous panel, we think we have a wonderful group of really, really smart people, enlightened folks that can help guide this conversation. I'm joined by Dr. Ammar Malik, who is currently at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, was previously at William and Mary College, and is a global authority on, in particular, development finance, but especially how China provides development aid and financing around the world. Also really privileged to be joined by Azeema Cheema. Azeema is a researcher and a pollster, and for the last several years has led Verso Consulting and has done numerous studies on how citizens engage with the state, both here in Pakistan, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Afghanistan. And we're privileged to be joined, in my case, once again, a frequent sort of partner in conversation, the former finance minister and health minister in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Taimur Khan. So let's begin without much further ado. I wanted to start with you, Dr. Malik, because at some level, this question of what a citizen is getting out of a country has to be undergirded by something. Some people think that that should be rights. Some people think it should be voice. Other people think it should be entitlements. Others think it should be public services. But no matter which of those it is, the one thing that states and countries need is the ability to pay for whatever they're providing. So if it's security, you got to pay for it. If it's rights, you have to have a system of, enforcement, again, that you have to pay for. If it's education, it's health, it's nice swimming pools, it's nice roads, nice cars, nice hospitals and airports. All of these things need money. And to my mind, based on what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, especially after COVID, a lot of money is drying up around the world. So I just wanted to ask whether you could illuminate our thinking on the financing aspect of how citizens live their lives.
Musharraf, as I reflect on 2024 and think ahead of 2025, one of the standout data points that I've been thinking about has to do with the net flow of financing from rich to poor countries. So developed countries transferring funds in different ways to developing countries. And I think 2023 was a pivotal moment because this is the first time in recent memory that net financial transfers actually went negative. So what I mean by that is in as late as 2016, rich countries transferred about $200 billion worth of development financing and other financing to low and middle income countries. But in 2023, $50 billion is actually going to transfer back to rich countries. And that is because there was a lot of infrastructure financing that happened in the mid-2010s. It was a low interest rate environment. Interest rates have gone up. Economically, countries are stagnating. So I think this is a pivotal moment for us to reflect on what that actually means for citizens in developing countries.
But I want you to repeat that because I really want the audience for it to land with the audience. 2025 will be the first year in a long time, or was it 2023?
2023 is already that year where net financial transfers have gone negative. So more money is actually leaving developing countries than arriving in developing countries net. And this number is only going to increase. We have projected at the One campaign, it's a aid advocacy group based out of London. They've projected that this is going to increase to 50 billion in 2024. And I think that is really, it's a soul-searching moment for us, because this era where developing countries were sitting and waiting on foreign donors to come and set the agenda, provide the financing from development, I think that era might be over. And on top of that, if you look around in Europe, in the United States, the way the politics is working out, a lot of governments are not going to be in the mood to dole out big development financing checks to developing countries anymore.
Well, lots of Trump cabinet picks, Ammar, are already talking about shutting down U.S. aid. There's Labor, which was expected to renew its 0.7% of GDP contribution to ODA, to Overseas Development Aid. They have basically broken that long-standing, 3-decade-long promise. So there's already signs. What does this mean for a country like Pakistan?
So what this means is, like, if you look at the 75 poorest countries in the world, according to the same analysis, $185 billion were spent just in debt servicing. Pakistan is one of them. And that means that these countries combined spend more on debt servicing than on health, education, and infrastructure. That's 7.5% of their entire GDP. So this means that countries have a real fiscal squeeze. Their ability to spend on development has really suffered as a result of this fiscal pressure. And I think this is going to show up in our conversation today and for the future of service delivery, because essentially that's the relationship between a state and its citizens. It is the essentials of service delivery. And if countries are not going to have the fiscal space to continue to spend on that, and development financing from abroad is not going to land in the same way, I think there has to be a conversation about fundamental reforms and changes in the way governments are run.
Taimur, want to bring the conversation to you. You, of course, handled the, I think, incredibly difficult responsibility of health and finance at maybe the most complex time in our memory, in our lifetime, certainly, which was through the COVID period. And whatever the politics was around that, and I'm sure you'll address some of that, I wanted maybe for you to start with reflecting on your time as minister and how you dealt with the challenge of financing. At some level, I think the argument some people in Pakistan might make is, look, provinces don't have a financing problem because of the NFC.
I think that while what Ammar said is correct, that there are a couple of ways of addressing the problem. Right? I think if we look at what citizens expect and what actually leads to a sense of citizens in any country or society being content, it's probably a combination of A, quality of life, B, the services that the state provides to those citizens through whatever model, and C, a sense of, for lack of a better word, freedom, right? And by freedom I mean what you see or what we typically experience through the times that we've lived in Western societies, on a sense of security, a sense of being able to say what you want, a sense of the law protecting you. I think a combination of these three things being in place at different levels allows a society or citizenry to be content, or at least their perception of it, right? And perhaps sometimes one of these factors being further developed than the other can mitigate, right? So take, for example, examples of countries such as Singapore or the smaller countries in the GCC, so the likes of the UAE or Qatar, where, we may not have the sort of freedom that, say, Western societies or what we would like to think of as democracies do, but they're compact with their citizens in terms of what they deliver, right? Perhaps makes up for that. It's less visible in more complex societies, even when they are small, in the same region, such as, say, Bahrain. I think, though, that coming to what you asked, right, I think that this can be addressed at different levels. And let me take it in Pakistan. I think the folly that decision makers in Islamabad, whether in the federal government or whether in the apparatus of state, that tends to sometimes have a greater role than the government itself, think is that that decision making can happen from Islamabad. It's first not possible, right? And second, it's an incorrect model, right? Because so much of what actually happens and is delivered as close to the coal face of what citizens experience as possible. And that's where I think the role of a provincial government or a provincial finance minister comes into place. I think the first thing, so if you ask me to reflect on my time, the 2 or 3 conclusions that I drew from my time was, one is, it's absolutely right that we need to try and deliver services that increase the credibility of citizenry in the state. And every time we did that effectively, for example, through the Sehat Card, our universal health insurance program, I think it did more than actually provide a benefit to the citizens of Pakhtunkhwa. It increased their trust in the state. The second thing that I think you can do is to actually lead the way in terms of utilizing or transferring what you get from the international community. And I think in that sense, the difference between having a mindset where you work with donors because the donors are giving you some money and you just want that money to come in, and 2, whether large or small, you want your donors or development partners to assist your agenda. I think you will find that if you adopt the second model, you will both get more done, and the quantum of financing available to you or not through the international community will be less relevant. And we certainly tried to do that through COVID. And I think to pick another problem where I believe, and I'd love to actually talk about this in some more detail, but it's a separate session. The reason why there are pockets in the world where we don't address a problem such as polio is because I don't think that the governments that are actually addressing it are addressing it for themselves. They're addressing it because organizations such as the Gates Foundation or UNICEF or other international organizations are pumping in a bit of money to get them to eradicate polio. And so they go through the rights, but we never actually eradicate the problem. So if you make that shift, you can actually deliver more. And I think the third conclusion, and we've talked a lot about this, is that while this answer may be different for different countries, but I think in a place like Pakistan is the role of federalism, right? One person does not know better than everyone else. Islamabad is not best placed to decide for the entire country. And so if you actually accept that principle, and whenever we have done as a country, we've moved a little bit forward in terms of our national development and the contentness of citizenry in terms of owning the concept of Pakistan, because they feel that Pakistan accepts their vision of who they are, right? I think that takes us forward and takes the citizen state compact forward. When we don't accept it, it has exactly the opposite effect. And unfortunately, I think Pakistan's history is littered with a mindset in the center that seems to think that federalism is a centrifugal force that will tear the country apart rather than create space for the different elements of the country to stick together.
Since we are talking about the citizen, before I come to you, Azeema, because I think a lot of questions emerged that I think you're best placed to answer, but I did want to maybe not challenge, but certainly posit your thesis back to you. If somebody in Islamabad doesn't know better for the Peshawar Valley or for the people of Karachi, then certainly somebody in Karachi or somebody in Lahore or somebody in Peshawar doesn't know better for the people of Jacobabad or the people of Mianwali or the people of Kadak or Bannu. So when subnational governments have had the opportunity to govern relatively autonomously, they haven't really demonstrated any alignment with that principle outside of Islamabad doesn't know better. Then somehow Peshawar becomes kind of the central government, and there's no further devolution of either administrative or fiscal or political powers. I know there have been different models in KP and Sindh and Punjab, but I think if we're having an honest conversation, those have really been forced by judicial intervention. Why does that gap exist amongst folks that I think principally do believe in federalism? But I think the federalism gets kind of limited to the provincial capitals as opposed to going further towards a local governance model.
So first of all, I think on a lighter note, certainly in a place like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, whereas there are elements of these models, it almost never gets focused on the provincial capital because there's been no chief minister from the provincial capital in the last 40 odd years, since Arbab Jahangir in 1985, right? So if you were to pick your model, it actually ends up going to where the center of power is.
So we should really then hope that PK 76 kind of emerges as a...
No, that's not my constituency, if that's what you mean. But no, I think that I think this is a question that is a legitimate question, but often posed for illegitimate reasons.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, this is often posed by people who actually don't want to devolve power, right, as a means to to stop the devolution of power to provinces and then below. Look, the best example of a unionist or a centralist state not working in Pakistan is FATA. FATA was governed by the center for about 70 years. You tell me the least developed part of Pakistan on the basis of any human development indicators. I mean, Islamabad's been governing it. It should be paradise. It is the exact opposite, right? The second best example of this is Balochistan, which effectively since the troubles over there, again to use a cautious word, since the mid-2000s, has largely been governed with the greatest input from Islamabad and the Pakistani power establishment. It hasn't solved anything. So it is certainly legitimate that we should devolve power below the provinces. And I think that it isn't done for selfish reasons, but that's because of the national psyche. Otherwise, you should actually have a local government system in Islamabad that should be the blueprint for everyone to follow, and where a mayor of Islamabad or a chief minister of Islamabad actually runs the city. And if the center gets that model right, rather than getting the interior minister and the prime minister to run Islamabad, it can actually shame cities like Karachi and Peshawar and Quetta and Lahore into adopting behaviors of local governance. Why doesn't it? Because it's the national psyche to sort of just hoard power to yourself. And the reason that people hoard power to themselves is because in a country with almost no power structures, and the only certainty other than death being the disruption to the continuity of the political system, being that people effectively try and make the most of the time they have, and our governance system doesn't evolve. I think that, Musharraf, and you and I have seen this together though, as checkered as the record of provincial governance is, if you look at what provinces have achieved post 18th Amendment in the areas of health or education, or even in the areas of local government in terms of municipal delivery, I think you will find, and I challenge anyone to do any empirical study, they will find progress that is greater than the center, if you like, controlling any territory, right, through Islamabad.
I think absolutely, and this is
and sorry, you just want to give a couple of very quick examples.
If you don't mind, I want to bring Azeema
in 20 seconds, whether it's the number of teachers hired, whether it's the attempts to make teacher recruitment more meritocratic, whether it is actually a focus to try and get out of school children into school, whether it is similar attempts to either get more doctors into the system or to use alternative delivery mechanisms such as health insurance or public-private partnerships. It's all happened because provinces need to deliver for their people.
This has been a point of agreement and alignment for many years between you and I, Taimur, partly because we've worked on some of this stuff together. Azeema, when you have this equation of insecurity in terms of the political power centers in the country, I guess a generic question is, what impact does that have on the citizen-state relationship? And you have now going on at least 2.5 decades of data that you've examined in quite a lot of depth, including as recently as perhaps, if I'm not mistaken, the last couple of months, that looks at citizen-state relations and the confidence citizens have in the system that they're a part of. Where are we on that front today? And of course, the purpose of today's conversation is to look forward, but I think it's important to locate where we are right now.
No, I very happily do that, locating for you, but I think it's very interesting. You proposed this subject, and it's very interesting to me how we've all come at it with different perspectives. You know, Ammar's talking about that changing architecture of development financing and what the implications of that are going to be. Taimur's come at it from a perspective of center-periphery relations. And I actually want to bring the generational argument right into the center of this. Look, Pakistan is a very young country, right? And one of the reasons why you have a skewed locus of decision making is because decision makers are considerably older than the constituency for which they are making decisions. Everything that Taimur talked about in terms of center-periphery relations, right, points to this subtext, which I will state quite clearly. You have, at this moment, and this is not specific to Pakistan, but you have youth across the country, across demographics, gravitating towards leaders who look like them, who speak like them, who share their experiences, who are leading some kind of social or political movement, whether that is in Balochistan, whether that is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, whether that is now in Punjab. And I think that also explains Pakistan's particular populist phenomena that Pakistan has experienced, because you have a young country gravitating towards individuals who appeal to the aspirations of young people. And this is where I want to put Pakistan as, you know, speak specifically on Pakistan's very unique problem. We have had 2 decades of young people who have grown up in the 21st century who have felt quite ostracized from the rest of the world, right? Pakistanis have found it difficult, more difficult than their counterparts from South Asia, to engage in the international community, to compete with the international community, and who have, well, to travel, but also, Musharraf, we are dealing with a generation that has grown up with the internet. They're not used to even digital phones, or you know, or they don't know what to do with an instrument where they have to physically dial. Now, you are dealing with a generation that has lived with a different set of tools, with a different set of reflexes. And at the end of the day, this central question about the state-citizen contract that you have posed rests on a judgment by the citizen on 3 things. And again, there are lots of other things that can be part of this equation, but on 3 things. What are my opportunities? And to assess that, the 3 things are: is the state my friend? Is the state absent? Or is the state actively standing in my way? So when you, for instance, take a particular measure to degrade the internet and to degrade connectivity, it immediately lessens the opportunity that young people have, whether that means opportunity to engage, whether that means the opportunity to pursue independent kind of livelihoods, or whether that means to pursue innovation, or whether that means to pursue a better pathway for a relationship with the state. You're taking all of those opportunities away from them. And I'm at this point just speaking about the generational divide. I am not speaking about the gender divide within the generational divide. So I think that's perhaps...
If you don't mind, could I ask you to do
yeah.
that? Because I think that's an integral part
All right,
of this.
sure. I think
because half the citizens, if
Yeah.
we're having a conversation about citizens, half the citizens in the country are of one gender and half
Right.
are of another. So what is that dynamic? How does it play out?
I mean, look, I think what you have is very, very, very few facilities and services that are specifically targeted towards making life easier, making opportunities better for women, right? There's also sort of customary exceptions that are made. You go into an office as a bureaucrat, you go through an airport, for instance, you have to go through a particular designated line. Basically we deliver a lot of segregated services, so the facilities for women are a lot less. A lot of women, in order to interact with the state, have to engage male agents, whether those male agents belong to their families or whether those male agents are whoever is willing to help them out in a safe way. But when it comes to taxation, look, women have lesser access to resources, women have lesser access to assets, and women have performed roles such as homemakers, where a lot of the employment that women engage in is unpaid, right? So when it comes to taxation, women disproportionately gravitate towards a salaried employment because the structures are safer, they are more, they're more available to them. And taxation policy is one area where you absolutely recognize women as just equal citizens without recognizing the structural inequality for women. So I think that's one example. Women have navigated the digital sort of divide by replicating the same sort of structures of parda, for instance, or by replicating the same sort of social boundaries that they would maintain physically in the digital space, and within that they're trying to pursue a lot of employment, right? So they need those opportunities more, and therefore are also disproportionately affected negatively by the kind of controls that have been placed on, the internet. But it comes back to that point about insecurity. Why are these controls? What is the impetus for these controls? It is largely a state anxiety about youth expressing some kind of identity and trying to pursue some kind of conversation with the state vis-a-vis the state's behavior. So we talk a lot about citizen rights, fine. We talk a lot about citizen responsibility, and we talk about state rights within the international system, but what we don't often do, and we don't do enough of, is talk about state responsibility when measures like this are enacted. So I'm going to leave it there.
No, don't leave it there. There's a lot more there to unpack, but I think this is a great segue to what I wanted to ask you, Ammar, this fulfillment of responsibility. How are other countries dealing with this? Surely Pakistan isn't the only country that faces a demographic. I think the greatest opportunity any country might have had in my life is a country like Pakistan, with now, as of 2025, half of this country was born in 1998 or thereafter. It's a remarkable, for somebody as old as me, that's an incredible statistic. Half the country was born in 1998 or after. Further, half the country is of a gender that is systematically excluded from economic engagement. Forget about all the other aspects, but pure economic engagement is harder for women than it is for men. Pure economic engagement and voice expression is harder for young people than it is for older people, and especially richer people, more wealthy people. So when you put all this together, the question I have for you is, when you look at development aid flows, and in particular I want to ask you about China, how have other countries dealt with these challenges? And what is, maybe even expound further and tell us, what is the China perspective on how countries should deal with this challenge?
I think if you look at examples of countries that have grown, I think they have gone through a long-term process on making investments in their population. Azeema and Taimur have both talked about the need for engaging with citizens, giving them training and skills that they need, safety that they require, access to services. All of that, Musharraf, at the end of the day, requires some fiscal space. And I think we have to get out of this mindset of waiting on foreign aid dollars to show up and make that happen for us. In fact, I feel that sometimes the entire development agenda is not as home-driven as it ought to be. Countries that have fundamentally reformed have created the fiscal space through reforms internally to be able to make those decisions for its population. So if you look at, for example, the total sum of development financing in a country like Pakistan, just over half of it comes from domestic resources. And the share that comes from foreign aid is about 10%. And the same is true for sub-Saharan Africa. Pakistan relies quite a bit on remittances, and we don't talk enough about the developmental impact that remittance flow creates for people who are facing life-threatening situations and perhaps rely on that paycheck from Saudi Arabia to get a surgery done, right? So people are coming up with all sorts of ways to get their health and education right, but unless the state has the fiscal space and the ability to invest in its own people, collect more domestic revenues, introduce technologies that help them do that, I think the space will be very limited. And another statistic I think I would put forward is, or a point is economic growth. I think we have to have a mid to long-term economic growth strategy in this country. Short of that, I don't see any hope of us making use of this demographic dividend. Just consider a few facts I brought for you. If you look at all developing countries, when a country moves from a least developed country or a low-income country to a lower middle-income country,
which is where Pakistan
is. Where Pakistan is.
Yeah.
The amount of money that the state can spend per person on health goes from $105 to about $300, just from going to low income to lower middle income. But then when you go from lower middle income to upper middle income, it goes up 5 times to about $1,000. Right. And the same trend is true for education. So creating economic growth creates the fiscal space for the state to invest in its citizens. And I think unless we have a credible medium to long-term growth strategy in place, this is not going to happen.
Talk a little bit about sort of how China looks at all this and what its own model is and what it is trying to promote with its aid, because clearly a lot of the development financing flows now in Pakistan have been China-centered. So
as we've discussed at this forum, Musharraf, China is a very demand-responsive actor. I would say that globally, just about 10% of development financing that China provides is actually aid, what we would traditionally call like a grant or a low interest rate. Most of what China provides is infrastructure through loans, concessional lending. And the level of concessionality, of course, varies by the sector, what it has. I think the fundamental benefit of China's arrival in Pakistan would have been if we could have converted those capital inflows 10 years ago in energy and transport into credible economic opportunities for these young people that Azeema and Taimur are talking about. And that would have required governance, better governance, so that a Chinese private company could have made use of the Rashakai Special Economic Zone, not because there is a plot of land and a gas connection, but because we have the population, the skilled people who can actually build something that is world-class and can export it. And that translation has not happened for a multitude of reasons.
That's what I wanted to bring to your attention. Taimur, it seems like so much of the decision-making that is fundamental to citizens' lives is completely divorced from any consideration of the citizen. So a lot of these macro-level conversations about Pakistan's fuel mix or Pakistan's energy mix or Pakistan's choices in terms of which development financing partner to engage with are really driven by considerations that have nothing to do with how it'll affect the citizen. Having worked at the provincial level in a sense negotiating between the citizen and both the federal, not the federalist, but the federal and the global actors, how have you found that experience? how much pressure have you felt, or do you think provincial actors feel, to almost represent and proxy for citizen interest? And to what extent do you maybe think that perhaps even subnational and provincial governments have really not been able to personify the citizen in the policy-making realm?
Look, here I actually think it's not just provincial actors, but any actors that come through the force of a public mandate or public legitimacy to some extent or the other, right, are compelled to think about citizen issues. You can argue more, you can argue less, it depends on personality, and it depends a little bit on the national culture and ecosystem to an extent. But I think the reason ultimately that Pakistan doesn't deliver for its citizens is Pakistan is run by the bureaucracy, the civil and military bureaucracy, and they're not trained nor incentivized to think of citizenry. And because of that, I actually think, and you actually see it through some of the decisions in the government today, Pakistan is a state where the citizens exist to subsidize or finance those running it.
Hence, perhaps you have the taxation. So when it comes to taking from the citizen, Pakistan will treat women equally. But when it comes to providing for citizens, there'll be no
because what is more important is the salary of the DMG official running the Ministry of Finance. What is more important is the pensions of those that have already retired, that can be financed through those working in government, but are financed through either debt or through additional taxation on those that derive no service from the government, right? And I think because of this, we are simply not able to actually create the sort of virtuous cycle where citizens feel that there is some that their contribution to the state is useful. As long as they don't feel that, the average middle class citizen, when he sees all around him that the state itself is being extractive, will try and be extractive as well. Now, let's just go a little bit towards the solutions. I think the solutions are actually not that difficult, but they are tied to political stability, and they are tied to a governance system as enshrined in our constitution. So, for example, what do we expect? We expect economic opportunity. And for that, we need a vibrant economy that to some extent is anchored in a free market, right? But for that free market economy to work, we need investment. And that investment will not come until investors think there is some political stability, some predictability that can generate returns. We want to invest in health and education, and we should. And I think the good news is that actually, if you look at the numbers, the real investment that you really need is in what I call OPEX, operational expenditure, not in building more schools, not in building more hospitals, or in getting different delivery modes to work. So actually, I don't think you need a lot of donor money for this. You need to be able to adapt your delivery models. And I'll give you one example of an adapted delivery model and how our politics of the state gets in the way. I'll give you two examples. Our health insurance was perhaps the most popular social sector program in the history of this country. It was maligned for the simple reason that once our government was gone, Imran Khan needed to be maligned, and hence, right, the health insurance program that was perhaps his biggest success needed to be maligned.
The irony of this, I should say, of course, is that in 2016, the original model for this came from the PMLN in the federal. I know that it was different as you adopted it, but you know, for an objective viewer, the real irony is that they villainized something that they actually should have taken credit for.
So the model actually came from the German aid agency. And because it went to a federal government and a provincial government at the same time, the federal government being more distant from the citizens did not understand the need to implement it. The provincial government being closer to the citizens actually implemented it. So that's the actual truth. But the bigger point is, once the caretaker regime had maligned the health insurance program, and the other thing that they did was to malign the public-private hospitals that existed and are the best example of service delivery in FATA since the merger, two things happened. In terms of the insurance, look at the next time any of these governments asks the market to bid for the next wave of the insurance, and look at the premiums go up. Because no one is going to have any trust in the state of Pakistan being true to its word. And similarly with the public-private partnership model being maligned and never actually having recovered in the way that it was intended. Think of any major private sector player that wants to make investments in health will not make those investments because they know they will have to deal with some sort of vindictive government action that is just hostage to the cycle that we bring.
So this hostility, I want to bring this to Azeema. Azeema, I noticed that you and I perhaps were having the same reaction to the point Taimur just made about the bureaucracy and its role in all this. Because in some ways, even the last thing that was mentioned, why is it so easy for the state to develop hostility to its own creations? For example, the social insurance or the health insurance mechanisms that Taimur worked on when he was minister. And perhaps part of the reason is that this is a bureaucratic structure and a bureaucracy that is fundamentally and by definition and character disconnected from the citizen. What does that end up doing to citizen-state relations, especially in terms of the evidence that you've seen over the last several years?
I mean, look, I find it so easy to agree with Taimur when he's out of power. It's kind of natural, harmonious synergy that we find, but I think what Taimur was saying is actually quite important. Taimur's pointing out that we still have the idiosyncrasy of a post-colonial set of institutions that believe their role is public management, not public service, right? Their role is public management. So everything, every decision is taken with the lens of how to control citizens, how to curb citizens, or how to engage citizens through a set of rules and guidelines. What there isn't a systematic approach to is getting citizen feedback and working that up. And I'll give an example. I'm going to give some credit to Taimur here because he's sitting here. He talked a lot about pension reform, right, when he was in government. And one of the things that I was noticing parallel at that same time, because of the research we were doing, was that in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and in Gilgit-Baltistan, there are pockets where there's absolutely no denial whatsoever of climate change being the biggest problem, right? And you have a lot of young people who are gravitating towards that, but when it comes to subnational governments, there is a very clear fiscal tension between pressure from politicians and bureaucrats to provide compensations, i.e. the outlay, right? The financial outlay to the citizen in order to get the quick credit instead of putting that money into resilience and adaptation programs, right? This is everything. All of these schemes are political, they're politically branded. I found that debate quite silly, so I didn't want to get into it, right? But there's evidence and counter evidence. But the approach is, look, we have a short term in government. A term in Pakistan government tends to be shorter for elected governments in Pakistan because, assemblies get dissolved. So what we need to do is put our name on the maximum amount of direct outlay that we can give to the citizens. I mean, one exception here is that in 2013, the Benazir Income Support Program was not rebranded. under the PMLN, right? But social protection conceived as only this financial outlay instead of a citizen-driven process, you could shift it and you could finance it by all the money that Taimur would save by doing pension reform. But it somehow faces so many political barriers because of a lack of incentive for each actors that we never get there.
Well, a lack of incentive, Azeema, or is it the, I think, surplus of incentives? I mean, for example, we talked a little bit about local governance, and it's clear to me that one of the big losers, if you were to have an effective local governance systems, would be the kind of unlimited power that is enjoyed by civilian bureaucrats at the federal and provincial and local level. And so why would a bureaucrat-led system lead a reform of subnational governance that produced more engaged citizens with local governance? I think, this is really, I'm trying to frame this as a question. Where does one turn to point to some greater demand for local governance from citizens? Because to my mind, this is a infatuation that somebody like myself has, perhaps Taimur has, perhaps you have, but I don't see how we can convince the powers that be of investing more robustly in local governance without some proof that this is something that people want.
I don't think that they respond to the proof of what people want. I think what Taimur pointed out is that at this point, in every shape and form, whether it's the taxation structure or whether it is the distribution of spoils, right? We are, in an economic crisis. We've been on the verge of a collapse, right? The currency devaluations have been such that the sort of the middle generation has lost a huge chunk of its savings. They are now borrowing from their children's retirement to finance their retirement. These kids are then going to borrow from their children. That is the generational structure of how people are going to live their lives. They're going to be less rich. They're going to be less well off in comparison to their older generations. And the state does not seem to respond to those because it looks like there is a total policy paralysis, right? Everything that we're doing is we're using citizens to try to manage the debt, and any money that is being made in the country is being used to distribute, expand that patronage net to different state actors. So it's at this point a collusion of state actors against citizens.
So
right?
I think this is the point at which, something that at some level I think many of us would like to avoid, but I think it's inescapable, Taimur, is a conversation about, on the big macro numbers, there is increased stability. To whoever one wants to credit, I would credit the sitting government with at least enough responsible decision making that there seems to be a stabilization on a lot of the macro numbers. Inflation, the rate of inflation has slowed dramatically. There's, the reserves are stable for now. There's lots of questions around those macro stability numbers. How sustainable are they? How vulnerable Pakistan is to an external shock? But by and large, things have, without exception, objectively improved at the macro. And yet, because of the denial of what the citizen wanted, perhaps on February 8th, when I say perhaps, what I mean by that is there's still a debate about the extent to which the results were compromised, but there's no debate that they were compromised. And certainly thereafter, I think what we saw on the 24th, 25th, and 26th was one manifestation of how citizen will was being countered, and in this case countered in quite extreme ways. Perhaps it was also manifest in extreme ways, but without getting into the nitty-gritty of those debates, it is clear that when you don't have a response from the state to what the citizens are asking for, you have the buildup of something. What is that something in your lived experience, again, representing, you're a Pakistani, but certainly, you live and breathe in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and that's certainly an important place of interest for anybody that cares about this country. What is the citizen-state relationship status today, in KP in particular?
Let me get to that. let me get to that, but let me just actually deal with this question on the economy. I think when we even take off our political hats, I think what you will see is that we're simply recovering from perhaps the worst trough of the economic cycle that we have every 5 or 6 years. That typically happens after we go to the IMF. But I think you will find that this is the weakest recovery that we have because it's the one built on the least sound fundamentals, where politically the relationship between citizens and state has been damaged the most. Because of this, because of what you called or what I'd call the forgery of the general election results, again, it doesn't matter what has happened before, because as you said, the majority of this nation is born after 1998, and the majority of this nation was voting for the first time, and the majority of this nation saw its vote disappear for the first time. So what happened before is in a way irrelevant to them, right? It is irrelevant to what they see in terms of what they should be able to expect from a state. I think you see the discontent, and I think you see the government trying to react to that by suppressing their voices. Now, I was often thinking why this is important, because I think when our generation was growing up, we also grew up in an era of General Zia, where we pretty much knew that we had limited voice. But I think that was the norm at that point, to an extent, right? And I think at this point, in an era where people are used to expressing themselves, to take that away, and I saw you pick plenty of words with deliberate caution as you were speaking, and perhaps rightly so, right? I think it feels much more painful when you have something that you expect taken away from you. So I don't think, first, the economy is doing as well as it would have for people to be able to compromise their personal freedoms, not by any stretch. And you see that by the complete lack of confidence of any investment in Pakistan. And I think citizens feel more suffocated than they ever do. And I think what that ends up resulting is in state reactions that are more irrational and that actually block all potential pressure release valves in our governance system that allow uncontrolled reactions to take place. And that's, I think, what we risk, and what anyone who actually feels Pakistani should want to avoid. Where stories and even progress don't necessarily mitigate this lack of freedoms can be told in our history. And I've been saying this recently. It's interesting that just a few months before the overthrow of Ayub Khan, he was celebrating a decade of development. And I think if we look historically, we'll see that there was perhaps more economic development indeed in that decade than at any point before or after in Pakistan's history. And I would actually also argue and make a case that maybe not on all indicators, but if you look on some indicators, that plenty of that development flowed to what was then East Pakistan as well, except that because there wasn't a political release valve, it didn't end up, the dollars invested there, fewer or more, didn't end up reducing discontent. Because people couldn't voice their discontent, it actually ended up increasing it, and we paid for that heavily. So when you talk finally of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa's relation with the state over the last 2 or 3 years, and I know this is an issue you understand, and I know why you've asked me that question, so I will answer it, right? It's interesting that when my generation grew up, we heard about the state of Pakistan's insecurity about a term called Pashtunistan, which was this superfluous movement of trying to integrate the Pashtun areas of Pakistan and the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan together. It always felt very weird, because my generation always has felt exceptionally attached to Pakistan, and has actually felt that, you know, we're as much the mainstream and the owners of this country as You know, anyone from Lahore, anyone through Punjab, and probably more than communities that have felt more marginalized, for example, in Balochistan or the Muhajirs of Karachi or Sindh, right? And so it over time, as a student of history, my sense was that this was very much yesterday's issue. Now, what has happened over the last 2 or 3 years across Pakhtunkhwa, and in the last 5 or 6 years in the way the PTM issue has been dealt with in FATA, and some statements,
and Karachi,
and Karachi again, right? Because Karachi, I think, is the largest Pashtun city in the world. Or in the last couple of weeks in Islamabad, which I think is also now, at least we will claim it's a Pashtun majority city, right? I just don't understand why you want to poke a bear that doesn't even want to be poked, right? That's what the state of Pakistan is doing with Pashtuns. You have people go and talk about Pashtun resources not being given to them in their jahez. What's the need to say this? The constitution dictates what rights every province has over its resources. Why should anyone make ethnically inflammatory statements, right? And I think these statements were made in the context of PTM, but I can promise you it made every Pashtun across the country feel upset.
I think it's not just a matter of Pakhtuns feeling upset. I'm Team Kha instead of Team Shah. It's not a matter of Pakhtuns necessarily feeling upset. I think there's a wider question, which I want to attach, Ammar, to this. I don't think that we can divorce these topics, and this has been kind of my whole life's work has been that there is a certain kind of identity matrix that attaches to people's political aspirations, that is anchored in people's endowments and entitlements as citizens. And so it's about gap management, right? If there's a gap in service delivery, you have to manage it through the articulation of narratives that, cater. If there's a gap in those narratives, you have to manage it in terms of owning and embracing people, including, federal, grants and vertical programs. And ultimately, the way that you fix all of this is by fixing what the citizens have a fundamental right to, which is a safe life and a life of actualization, where their potential can be actualized. I want you to kind of summarize or maybe wrap up the conversation so far in terms of citizen entitlements and the cost of doing business for a state like Pakistan.
This is a great conversation. Obviously, I do agree with you, Musharraf, fundamentally, that all of these pieces that Azeema, Taimur have talked about and I've talked about, I think they're all connected with each other, because at the end of the day, the ability of the state to deliver services, whether it's at the provincial or the federal level, depends on its ability to, provide the service, collect revenue for it, and to ensure that the citizens can meet the aspirations that they have. So, for example, if you look at education or park services or women's ability to move around freely in our cities, that has a direct relationship to the fundamental issues of financing that I was talking about. I think the instruments for climate-related debt swaps is available at a scale that we've never seen before. The money is still there in the system. I think the season has changed.
The global system.
The global system,
yeah.
The money is to be made. But I think unless there is fundamental changes and a credibility signal from within this country to the global system, I don't think that those dollars will be unlocked in a way that would benefit our citizens.
And what is that sort of, what do those signals look like, to a kind of a neutral observer that doesn't understand the intricacies of how the IMF works or how the ADB works or how the AIIB works? What would those signals of credibility be?
I think we have to, and we've talked about this many times, this is not a new anything that I'm going to say, we need to have a reform process that divorces our boom and bust economic growth cycles from consumption. Like, we just keep growing and consuming more and running into deficit debts, and there might be some sort of adjustment on the debt situation that Pakistan faces. But I don't think that any of that is going to come through until we have a credible signal on the growth side of things. And I don't, at the moment, don't see that.
I think it's hard to see that in 20. I wanted this to be a positive, forward-looking conversation. So as we wrap the conversation up, Azeema, what do you see as potential avenues to address some of this? In the coming year, he talked about climate finance, but more importantly, he's talking about some sort of a reform agenda. Can Pakistan have a genuine, credible reform agenda with substantial numbers of Pakistanis as unhappy and disconnected from the state as they are today?
I think, look, Musharraf, here's, cards on the table. I'm more cynical than I have been ever in my life with the current setup and the kind of decision making that tells people that they're going to lose $1,200 worth of technology or whatever they bring into the country. That's the kind of messaging that really makes me question what the state is thinking and how they plan to steer this forward. Because in spite of, the macroeconomic fundamentals stabilizing, which Taimur has explained very well, right? How much of opportunity are you going to take away from citizens? It goes back to that point. Are you my friend? For a young person, vis-a-vis the state, are you my friend? Are you absent? Or are you just standing in my way? And frankly, it's the latter two that are happening. As far as I'm concerned, the state trying to find ways to be a friend to its citizens, not so much to be a friend to foreign investors who are trying to invest into this country. It's about being a friend to entrepreneurs within this country who, in spite of the state either being absent or standing in their way, have done well. I think the state doesn't know or recognize who and where those people are. The state does not recognize or understand how young people in this country have carved pathways to earn money for themselves, to engage with the international system. I think there are easy fixes, but somehow there's no research on this, there's no decision making around how to facilitate young people because the thought process hasn't gone there. So for me, it's a matter of switching the mindset. And for people like you who have access to senior policymakers, I would say put the question on the table. It's about bringing the same way that you did with Alif Elan, bring that question onto the political agenda.
I think, I'll have a chance to talk more about, what the agenda should be. As you know, we're wrapping up the day, inshallah, with Shahid Khaqan Abbasi, and there's been an ongoing conversation I've had with him and with others, including friends in the PTI, about the importance of some sort of a conciliatory pathway. Taimur, maybe that's the way forward, but I want you to frame it in the context of the citizen. What pathways do you see, other than the really obvious kind of big ticket ones? And I'm happy for you to mention those as well. I think we have to represent what we believe and what we are in these conversations for them to be meaningful. But are you optimistic about what's possible in 2025 in terms of renewing and refreshing this citizen-state conversation or relationship?
One is always optimistic. That's why I moved back to this country. That's why I'm here. But God does this country make it difficult. I think that's what Azeema was saying. And I think it's a fact. It's a fact that the government may not like, but that I don't think I have seen more pessimism in this country than I do today. It's to stifle that pessimism that we have all these restrictions on voices. The danger that creates is that in terms of correcting their actions, you actually don't get the feedback that you need to be able to correct those actions. But look, I think if we use what we've achieved in the past as a baseline for optimism, I think it's also unfair to say that Pakistan hasn't achieved a lot in the 77 years of its existence. It has progressed from what was a fairly artificial state to one that actually has showed its viability and certainly its resistance to dysfunction over almost 8 decades, right? If I were to say there is one thing that we need to do to start bringing more of that optimism back and to bring more of the results back, it's to say what we mean and to mean what we say. Whether that's about, so to take 2 or 3 examples, government and bureaucrat will like to say they're an open market economy, but they will hammer anyone who makes a profit by saying they're making excessive profits, right? They will like to say, and you saw the IT minister saying the other day, Pakistan has more free speech and freedom of speech than any other country in the world. You know, and I know that she herself doesn't believe what she said on the floor of the House. And to try and sort of encapsulate this in a simple example that we should all understand, because this is a country that cares about cricket, right, is, put it this way, the day we're able to bring a coach from Australia, and when he signs a contract, it's meant to say that he's going to manage the team, and he's going to help select the team, right? Here are the terms. And within 6 months, he doesn't have to resign because he says, look, you told me I'm supposed to do a job, but you don't want me to do my job. You don't mean what you say, right? Until we're able to just shift that for a cricket coach, we're not going to be able to shift that for the country. That is our problem. The world doesn't believe what we say because we make sure of it. If we make that shift, it will take not more than a generation to actually translate the potential of this country into reality. There's no doubt about it. And I think having all spent time abroad, right, I certainly use as motivation Bangladeshi friends. I certainly use as motivation from 20 years ago is when I did my MBA. And at that point, an Indian economy that was in early evolution, but my colleagues at business school, I was the only Pakistani at business school amongst about 60 different Indians who were the single largest community, who were all deciding whether they should accept jobs in New York or in Mumbai. Whereas we're still all, if we're looking at economic opportunity, looking to escape the country, right? It will take only a generation to shift that, but we just have to do simple things right.
Inshallah, hopefully that pivot in the road will be this coming year, the year 2025. It's been a really rich conversation. Taimur, thank you for participating in it. Azeema, for your contribution and your presence, and of course, Malik, who's always been generous with his time. Thanks a lot for joining us for this conversation. We'll return in a couple of hours with the third session of the day that is focused, inshallah, on the economy in 2025. I hope you enjoyed and learned from this, and of course, I hope that you'll let us know in the comments as to how you felt about it. We'll come back soon, inshallah. Thanks again. Khuda Hafiz.